The death certificate arrived by certified mail on a Wednesday in November, forwarded from an attorney's office in Durham, North Carolina, a document I'd requested as part of settling some old property disputes in my family that had been lingering since my grandmother's death the previous year. The certificate listed my grandfather Robert James Holloway as deceased on March 15, 1986. Cause of death listed as drowning after a boating accident on Jordan Lake. Body recovered 3 days after the incident and identified by personal effects found at the scene. I'd grown up hearing the story of how my grandfather had died in that accident when my father was only 19 years old, how the family had grieved the loss and moved forward without him, how my grandmother had raised 3 children alone after that tragedy had reshaped their lives in an instant. But attached to the death certificate was a letter from the attorney explaining that there had been an error in the filing, that recent database reconciliation had revealed that Robert James Holloway had been issued a new Social Security number in 1991, 5 years after his supposed death, and that the state was investigating possible identity fraud or administrative mistakes that might explain the discrepancy. The letter suggested I contact the Social Security Administration to clarify the situation, and it included a Durham address where correspondence related to the 1991 Social Security application had been sent, an address I didn't recognize, but that the attorney said might provide answers about what had happened to my grandfather after 1986. The attorney's letter included copies of documents showing that someone using my grandfather's name and birth date had applied for a driver's license in South Carolina in 1987, had registered to vote in Georgia in 1989, and had filed tax returns in North Carolina under a new Social Security number starting in 1991, all of which suggested that my grandfather had not died in that boating accident, but had instead disappeared and started a new life under his own name, but with a fabricated identity, number that allowed him to function in society without triggering flags in systems that should have shown him as deceased. I sat at my kitchen table reading those documents for an hour, trying to understand how someone could fake their own death and then continue living under their real name just a few states away from the family they'd abandoned, and why my grandfather would have chosen to disappear rather than face whatever problems had made him want to escape his life in 1986. My father had been devastated by his father's death, had struggled for years with the loss and with the responsibilities of being the oldest child in a family that suddenly had no male head of household, and learning that the death had been staged would mean confronting the reality that his grief had been based on a lie, and that his father had chosen to leave rather than staying to help his family through the difficulties they'd faced in the aftermath of his disappearance. Durham sits in the center of North Carolina's Research Triangle, a city that has transformed over the past 40 years from a tobacco and textile town into a hub of medical research and technology development. Its downtown now filled with renovated warehouses and new construction that has erased most traces of the industrial economy that dominated when my grandfather would have known the city. The neighborhoods spread out from the center in patterns that reflect waves of development and demographic change. Old mill villages adjacent to new subdivisions, working-class areas gentrifying as property values rise, and new residents move in seeking affordable alternatives to the expensive housing markets in Raleigh and Chapel Hill. By the time I drove down to investigate the address listed on my grandfather's 1991 Social Security application, the street had been transformed from whatever it had been 30 years earlier. Modest houses from the 1950s now renovated and expanded, their yards landscaped and their exteriors updated in ways that suggested an influx of money and new ownership that had changed the character of the entire neighborhood from what it must have been when my grandfather had lived there. If you want to discover how my grandfather staged his death in 1986 and built a new life just 3 hours from the family he abandoned, subscribe now, because what I found in Durham will reveal how people disappear in plain sight and the devastating reasons they choose to leave everything behind. The address on Faber Street led to a brick ranch that had been renovated extensively, its original structure barely visible beneath additions and modifications that had doubled its size and completely changed its appearance from the modest post-war house it had been originally. The current owner was a professor at Duke University who'd bought the house in 2005, and when I explained what I was investigating, she invited me inside and said she'd found some items left by previous owners in the attic when she'd renovated, materials she'd boxed up and stored in case anyone ever came looking for them. She brought out a cardboard box containing old mail and documents addressed to Robert Holloway at the Faber Street address, utility bills and bank statements from the early 1990s, and a folder of photographs showing a man I recognized as my grandfather standing in the yard of this house, older than in the pictures I remembered from my childhood, but unmistakably the same person. The professor said she'd wondered about those items when she found them, had considered trying to track down the former owner to return them, but had ultimately decided to keep them in storage in case they turned out to be important to someone. And now here I was, 7 years later, proving that her instinct had been correct. I spent 2 hours going through that box, while the professor made tea and worked on her laptop at the kitchen table, giving me space to process what I was finding. The documents showed that my grandfather had lived at the Faber Street address from 1991 through 2004, that he'd worked as a handyman and small contractor doing repairs and renovations for homeowners in the Durham area, and that he'd maintained a quiet, unremarkable existence under his real name despite the fact that he was supposed to be dead and buried in a cemetery plot in the town where he'd grown up. There were Christmas cards from people I didn't know, birthday greetings addressed to Bob from friends who'd apparently been part of his life in Durham, and photographs of my grandfather at cookouts and fishing trips with men whose faces meant nothing to me, but who'd clearly been close enough to him to document their shared experiences. The most striking thing about those photographs was how relaxed my grandfather looked, how the tension and weariness I remembered from my early childhood had been replaced by an ease and contentment that suggested he'd found something in his new life that had been missing from the one he'd left behind. The professor said the previous owner had mentioned that Bob Holloway had been a reliable tenant who'd always paid rent on time and had kept the property in good condition, that he'd been friendly but private in the way that some people are when they don't want neighbors getting too involved in their personal business, and that he'd moved out suddenly in 2004 with only a week's notice and no forwarding address. She'd assumed at the time that he was relocating for work or family reasons, hadn't thought to ask questions or push for details, and had been surprised when he'd left behind boxes of belongings that suggested a longer tenancy and deeper roots in the community than his abrupt departure would indicate. I asked if she remembered anything else about the previous owner's description of Bob Holloway, any details that might help me understand why my grandfather had chosen to live in Durham under his real name despite having faked his death 18 years earlier, and she said the previous owner had mentioned that Bob seemed like someone who'd come to Durham to start over, that he'd occasionally made references to a past he didn't want to discuss, and a family he'd left behind for reasons he never explained. The Durham County property records showed that my grandfather had never owned property under his name, had always rented, and had moved between addresses every few years in a pattern that suggested someone who wanted to maintain mobility and avoid putting down roots that would make him easy to track or locate. I found 3 different addresses associated with Robert Holloway between 1991 and 2004, all of them in working-class neighborhoods where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors' backgrounds or reasons for being there. The landlords at those addresses were mostly dead or had sold their properties and moved away, but I tracked down one elderly woman who'd owned a duplex on Guess Road where my grandfather had lived from 1995 to 1998. And she remembered him as a good tenant, who'd helped her with repairs around the property in exchange for reduced rent. She said Bob had been quiet and kept to himself, had never caused problems or attracted attention, and had always been respectful and polite in their interactions, even though he'd maintained a distance that discouraged personal questions or deeper acquaintance. The landlord said she'd wondered about Bob's background, had noticed that he never had visitors and never mentioned family or talked about his past before Durham, behaviors that suggested someone who was deliberately keeping his life compartmentalized and separate from whatever had come before. She'd asked him once why he'd moved to Durham, and he'd said something vague about needing a fresh start and wanting to live in a place where nobody knew him or had expectations about who he should be. And she'd accepted that explanation because Durham in the 1990s had been full of people reinventing themselves or escaping complicated pasts in other places. The landlord remembered that Bob had been skilled at carpentry and electrical work, that he'd done beautiful renovations on her duplex that had increased its value substantially, and that he'd seemed to take pride in his craftsmanship in ways that suggested the work itself was important to him beyond just earning money. She said he'd left her property in 1998, after she'd sold it to a developer, had packed up his belongings and moved without drama or complaint, and she'd lost track of him after that, though she'd occasionally wondered what had become of the quiet handyman who'd lived in her duplex for 3 years. I found my grandfather's name in Durham city directories from the 1990s, listed with various addresses, and with his occupation always shown as contractor or handyman. And I found business license records showing he'd operated under the name Holloway Home Repairs from 1992 to 2003, a sole proprietorship that had generated enough income to support a modest lifestyle, but that had never grown beyond my grandfather, working alone on small residential projects. The business records included customer names and addresses, and I started calling people from those lists, asking if they remembered Bob Holloway, and if they'd be willing to talk about the work he'd done for them, and what they remembered about him as a person. Most of the people I reached were surprised to hear from someone asking about a handyman they'd hired 20 or 30 years ago, but several remembered my grandfather clearly and spoke about him with warmth and respect, describing him as honest and reliable and skilled at solving problems that other contractors had said were too difficult or not worth attempting. One woman named Patricia Chen had hired my grandfather to renovate her kitchen in 1994, and she invited me to her house to talk about the experience and to show me the work he'd done that was still holding up perfectly 30 years later. Patricia said Bob had been recommended to her by a neighbor, that he'd given her a fair estimate and had completed the work on schedule and on budget, and that during the weeks he'd spent working in her house, they'd developed a friendship based on conversations about books and music and the kinds of topics that people discuss when they're spending hours in close proximity. She said Bob had been well-read and thoughtful, that he'd had opinions about literature and history that suggested more education than his working-class occupation would typically indicate, and that she'd sensed he was someone who'd had a different life before becoming a handyman, but who'd chosen this work for reasons that had nothing to do with ability or ambition. Patricia remembered asking Bob about his family, and he'd said he'd been married once, but it hadn't worked out, that he had children he didn't see anymore because of complicated circumstances he preferred not to discuss, and that he'd made peace with being alone and building a life that didn't include the traditional markers of family and community that most people pursued. Patricia showed me photographs of her kitchen renovation, images that included my grandfather working on the cabinets and countertops, and in those pictures, he looked focused and content, absorbed in work that clearly mattered to him even if it was just a residential remodel in a middle-class neighborhood in Durham. She said Bob had told her once that working with his hands helped him think, that the physical process of building and repairing things gave him a sense of accomplishment and purpose that he hadn't found in other aspects of his life, and that he valued the simplicity of jobs that had clear beginnings and endings and measurable results. Patricia said she'd stayed in touch with Bob for several years after the kitchen renovation, had hired him for other small projects, and had recommended him to friends who needed reliable work done, but that he'd gradually withdrawn from those connections and had eventually stopped returning her calls or responding to messages she left at his various addresses. She'd assumed he'd moved away from Durham or had decided to retire from the handyman business, and she'd thought about him occasionally over the years, but had never tried to track him down because she'd sensed that he valued his privacy and wouldn't appreciate someone from his past inserting themselves into whatever life he'd built after leaving the contracting work behind. The question that dominated my thinking as I worked through the evidence of my grandfather's life in Durham was why he'd chosen to fake his death in the first place, what problems or pressures in 1986 had been severe enough to make disappearing seem like the only viable option. I found newspaper archives from that period and searched for any mention of Robert Holloway in connection with crimes or legal troubles, and I discovered an article from a Raleigh paper in March 1986 reporting that Robert James Holloway had been questioned in connection with an embezzlement investigation at the manufacturing company where he'd worked as an accountant for 15 years. The article said he'd been placed on administrative leave while the company conducted an internal audit, that he'd denied any involvement in the missing funds, and that the investigation was ongoing. I found a follow-up article from April 1986, published 3 weeks after my grandfather's supposed death by drowning, reporting that the embezzlement investigation had been closed after Robert Holloway's death in a boating accident. That company officials had declined to comment on whether they believed Holloway had been responsible for the missing funds, and that the case had been filed away as unresolved pending any new evidence that might emerge. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, my grandfather's disappearance coming exactly 2 weeks after he'd been placed on leave, and while the investigation was presumably getting closer to determining whether he'd actually stolen the money or been wrongly accused. I requested the police reports from the boating accident investigation, and the documents showed that my grandfather's boat had been found capsized on Jordan Lake, that his wallet and keys had been recovered from the shore, but that his body hadn't been found until 3 days later when it had washed up on the far side of the lake, several miles from where the boat had been discovered. The body had been badly decomposed from time in the water, the report said, and identification had been based primarily on clothing and personal effects rather than visual recognition, and the medical examiner had ruled the death accidental drowning based on the physical evidence and the circumstances of the boat being found capsized. I wondered if my grandfather had staged the accident himself, had deliberately capsized the boat and left his wallet and keys on the shore to make it look like he'd drowned, and then had stayed hidden while authorities searched for his body before producing a corpse that was decomposed enough to make positive identification difficult. I called the detective who'd investigated the boating accident, now retired and living in a golf community outside Raleigh, and he agreed to talk about the case even though it had been closed for nearly 40 years. His name was Frank Morrison, and he said he'd always had doubts about the accident, that something about the scene had felt staged in ways he couldn't quite articulate at the time, but that had bothered him enough to keep the case file in his personal records rather than destroying it. After the standard retention period expired, Frank said the body that had been identified as Robert Holloway had been in worse condition than 3 days in the water should have produced, that the decomposition had seemed accelerated in ways that suggested the body had been dead longer than the timeline of the accident would indicate, but that the medical examiner had attributed those inconsistencies to water temperature and other environmental factors rather than suspecting that the body might not actually be Robert Holloway at all. Frank had pushed for dental records to confirm the identification, but the family, my grandmother, had said she couldn't afford the cost of that level of verification and had been satisfied with the identification based on clothing and personal effects, and without family support for more extensive investigation, Frank hadn't been able to justify the expense or the effort of pursuing his suspicions. Frank said he'd heard rumors after the funeral that Robert Holloway had been involved in financial crimes at his workplace, that the embezzlement investigation had been serious enough that criminal charges might have been filed if Holloway had lived, and that some people believed he'd staged his death to avoid prosecution and to escape the shame of being exposed as a thief. Frank had wanted to investigate that possibility, had suggested exhuming the body and doing DNA testing to confirm whether the person buried under Robert Holloway's name was actually him, but his superiors had been reluctant to reopen a case that had been closed and had generated no complaints from the family or from the company where the embezzlement had allegedly occurred. Frank said the whole situation had felt wrong from the beginning, that experienced boaters like Robert Holloway didn't typically have accidents on calm days in familiar waters, and that the convenient timing of the death right when the embezzlement investigation was intensifying suggested planning rather than accident. But without hard evidence to contradict the official findings, Frank had been forced to let the case remain closed, and he'd spent the past 38 years occasionally wondering whether Robert Holloway was really dead or whether he was living somewhere under a new identity, having successfully escaped his old life and the consequences of whatever crimes he might have committed. I told Frank about the documents showing my grandfather had been alive and living in Durham under his real name from 1991 onward, and there was a long silence on the phone before he said that confirmed everything he'd suspected in 1986, that the body they'd identified as Robert Holloway had probably been someone else, maybe a homeless person, or an unidentified drowning victim whose body my grandfather had used to stage his death and give himself time to disappear before anyone started looking. For him, too, carefully. Frank said it would have required careful planning and some luck to pull off that kind of deception, that my grandfather would have needed to find a body that was similar enough in size and age to be plausible, would have needed to plant his personal effects at the scene in ways that would lead investigators to the conclusion he wanted them to reach, and would have needed to time everything perfectly so that the body would be discovered in a condition that made detailed identification difficult. The fact that my grandfather had then lived under his real name in a city just 3 hours away from where he'd supposedly drowned, suggested either enormous arrogance or a calculated bet that nobody would be looking for a dead man, and that he could hide in plain sight by being completely unremarkable and attracting no attention from authorities or systems that might flag his continued existence. The embezzlement investigation records were sealed, but I filed a Freedom of Information request and eventually received redacted documents showing that approximately $75,000 had gone missing from the company's accounts during the period when my grandfather had been responsible for financial reconciliation, that internal audits had traced the missing funds to a series of small transfers that had been carefully disguised as legitimate business expenses, and that the investigation had been on the verge of presenting evidence to law enforcement when Robert Holloway had died, and the company had decided not to pursue the matter further. The documents suggested that company executives had been relieved by my grandfather's death, that they'd been worried about the publicity and potential liability that would come from admitting they'd been victims of employee theft, and that closing the investigation and writing off the loss had seemed preferable to a criminal prosecution that would have exposed their inadequate financial controls and damaged their reputation with investors and clients. I wondered if my grandfather had known the company would react that way, if he'd calculated that his death would end the investigation and allow him to keep the money he'd stolen, and if that money had funded his years in Durham living modestly but comfortably without any obvious source of income beyond the small contracting jobs he'd taken. I found bank records among the materials the Duke professor had saved from my grandfather's time on Faber Street, statements showing regular deposits that were larger than what his handyman work would have generated, and the deposits had come from an account in the Cayman Islands that had been set up in 1985, a year before my grandfather's supposed death. The offshore account suggested premeditation, that my grandfather had been planning his disappearance for at least a year before he'd executed it, that he'd been moving money out of reach of American authorities and setting up the financial infrastructure that would support him after he'd faked his death and started over in Durham. The deposits from the offshore account had continued until 2003, when the bank statements ended and the paper trail went cold, and I wondered if that was when my grandfather had finally run out of the stolen money, or if he'd simply closed that account and opened others that didn't leave records in boxes abandoned in attic storage. My father had never mentioned the embezzlement investigation, had never said anything about his father being accused of financial crimes or being under suspicion when he died, and when I called to ask him about it, he was silent for a long time before saying that my grandmother had told the children their father had died in a tragic accident and had forbidden them from discussing the circumstances or asking questions that might lead to painful revelations about what had really happened. My father said he'd been 19 years old and preparing to start college when his father had died, that the loss had derailed his plans and had forced him to stay home and help support his mother and younger siblings, and that he'd resented that sacrifice for years before eventually making peace with the choices circumstances had forced on him. Learning now that his father hadn't actually died, that the accident had been staged, and the grief had been based on a lie, meant confronting the reality that those sacrifices had been unnecessary, that his father had chosen to abandon the family rather than face the consequences of his crimes, and that the man my father had grieved and idealized had actually been a thief and a fraud who'd valued his own freedom more than his responsibilities to the people who depended on him. My father asked if I was certain about what I'd found, if there was any possibility that the documents and the evidence were mistakes, or that someone else had been using his father's identity in Durham, and I said I'd seen photographs and talked to people who'd known my grandfather in the 1990s and early 2000s, that there was no doubt the person living as Bob Holloway in Durham had been the same Robert Holloway who'd supposedly drowned in 1986. My father said he didn't know what to do with that information, didn't know whether to tell his siblings or his own children, didn't know whether exposing the truth would serve any purpose beyond destroying whatever positive memories they'd maintained of their grandfather, and forcing everyone to reconsider the foundational story of loss and resilience that had shaped their family's identity for nearly 40 years. I said I thought people deserved to know the truth, even if it was painful, that secrets like this tended to corrode families from the inside when they remained hidden, but that ultimately the decision about what to share and with whom was his to make, since he was the one who'd lived through the original loss and who'd be most affected by the revelation that it had all been a carefully constructed lie. I tracked down the cemetery where my grandfather was supposedly buried, a small plot in the town where he'd grown up, and I requested exhumation and DNA testing to determine whose body was actually in the grave under Robert Holloway's headstone. The process took 6 months and required court approval and cooperation from family members who had to be told why I wanted to dig up a grave that had been undisturbed for 38 years. But eventually the exhumation was approved and the body was tested, and the results came back showing that the person buried as Robert Holloway was actually an unidentified male, approximately the same age and build as my grandfather, someone who drowned in Jordan Lake around the same time as my grandfather's supposed accident, but whose body had never been claimed or identified by family or authorities. The medical examiner who'd performed the original autopsy in 1986 had retired and died, so I couldn't ask him how he'd missed the fact that the body wasn't Robert Holloway, but the current medical examiner said that decomposition and the limited identification technology available in the 1980s would have made it difficult to detect the substitution if the clothing and personal effects had matched, and if there had been no reason to suspect fraud. The revelation that my grandfather had used an unidentified drowning victim's body to stage his death raised new questions about how he'd managed to find that body and arrange for it to be at the right place at the right time, and whether he'd simply gotten lucky that another drowning had occurred near his staged accident, or whether he'd somehow caused that drowning or had obtained the body through other means I didn't want to contemplate. Frank Morrison, the retired detective, said it was possible my grandfather had been monitoring reports of bodies found in Jordan Lake and had waited for the right opportunity to stage his accident, that he'd been patient and calculating enough to wait until circumstances aligned in ways that would make his disappearance plausible, and the identification of a substitute body seem routine and unremarkable. Frank said the investigation would have been different if he'd known in 1986 what we knew now, that he would have pushed harder for positive identification and would have questioned the convenient timing more aggressively, but that hindsight was always clearer than the real-time decision-making that happened when you were working a case with limited resources and institutional pressure to close matters quickly and move on to other priorities. I hired a private investigator to track what had happened to my grandfather after he left Durham in 2004, where he'd gone and whether he was still alive. And the investigator came back 3 weeks later with information that my grandfather had moved to Florida, had lived in a retirement community near Tampa under his real name, and had died there in 2019 at age 83 after a brief illness. The investigator found an obituary listing Robert James Holloway as survived by no immediate family, preceded in death by his parents and various relatives, with no mention of a wife or children, or the family he'd abandoned 33 years earlier, when he'd faked his death and disappeared into a new life in Durham. The obituary said Robert had been a skilled craftsman who'd worked in home renovation and had been an active member of his retirement community, participating in woodworking clubs and volunteer projects, remembered by friends as quiet and private, but kind and generous with his time and skills. Reading that obituary felt surreal, seeing my grandfather's life reduced to a few paragraphs that made no mention of the people he'd left behind, or the crimes he'd committed, or the elaborate deception he'd maintained for more than 3 decades. The investigator found that my grandfather had been cremated and his ashes scattered at sea, that there was no grave to visit or physical place where anyone could go to remember him or confront him about the choices he'd made. I wondered if my grandfather had planned that final disappearance too, had arranged for cremation specifically to prevent anyone from using his remains to verify his identity or to connect him to the family he'd abandoned, and if even in death he'd been careful to cover his tracks and maintain the separation between his old life and the new existence he'd built after 1986. The retirement community where he'd lived had no records of next of kin or emergency contacts, just a notation that Robert Holloway had been a solitary individual who'd kept to himself and had never mentioned family or received visitors from outside the community during his 15 years of residence there. The community administrator I spoke with said Robert had been well liked but mysterious, that people had speculated about his background and wondered why such a skilled and intelligent person had ended up alone in a retirement community with no family connections, but that he'd deflected all personal questions and had maintained boundaries that discouraged the kind of deeper relationships that might have led to someone discovering his secret. I found people in the retirement community who'd known my grandfather during his final years, residents who'd worked with him on volunteer projects or had hired him to do small repairs in their units, and they described him as skilled and reliable but emotionally distant, someone who'd seemed to be going through the motions of social interaction without ever fully engaging or revealing anything meaningful about himself. One woman named Dorothy Sanders had been friendly with my grandfather, had invited him to dinners and community events, and she said he'd occasionally let his guard down enough to mention that he'd made mistakes in his past that he regretted, that he'd hurt people he'd loved and had chosen to live out his final years alone as a kind of penance for the pain he'd caused. Dorothy said she'd asked Robert about his family, and he'd said they were all gone, that he'd lost them long ago in ways that couldn't be repaired, and that he preferred not to talk about those losses because they brought up feelings he'd spent decades learning to suppress and manage. Dorothy showed me photographs from community events where my grandfather appeared in the background, always on the periphery of group shots, never quite integrated into the social fabric of the place despite living there for 15 years. She said Robert had been kind to her, had helped her with various projects, and had been a good listener when she'd needed someone to talk to about her own struggles with aging and loss, but that he'd never reciprocated by sharing his own stories or allowing her to provide the same kind of emotional support he'd offered her. Dorothy said she'd attended Robert's memorial service at the community center, a brief gathering with perhaps a dozen people who'd known him casually, but not deeply, and she'd wondered then who this man had really been beneath the quiet, competent exterior he'd presented to everyone who'd crossed his path in those final years. Now, hearing what I was telling her about his faked death and his abandoned family and the embezzlement that had forced him into hiding, she said she understood the sadness that had always seemed to hover around him, the sense that he was carrying weight that no amount of time or distance could fully remove. I shared everything I'd learned with my father and his siblings, showed them the documents and the photographs and the evidence that their father had staged his death and had lived for another 33 years without ever contacting them or attempting to repair the damage his disappearance had caused. My aunt, the youngest of the 3 siblings, said she'd always felt something was wrong about the drowning story, that it had seemed too convenient and too final in ways that hadn't matched what she'd known about her father's competence and caution around water, but that she'd been too young and too overwhelmed by grief to articulate those doubts or to push back against the official narrative that the adults had presented. My uncle said he'd spent his entire adult life trying to live up to an idealized image of his father, trying to be the kind of man he thought Robert Holloway had been before his tragic death, and learning now that the person he'd been trying to emulate had actually been a criminal and a fraud who'd abandoned his family felt like it invalidated everything he'd built his identity around. The 3 siblings spent a long afternoon at my father's house going through the materials I'd collected, looking at photographs of their father in his Durham and Florida years, reading the obituary that made no mention of their existence, and trying to process the reality that the foundational trauma of their family's history had been a deliberate act rather than a random tragedy. My father said he wanted to visit the places where his father had lived after 1986, wanted to walk the streets in Durham where Robert Holloway had worked as a handyman and see the retirement community in Florida where he'd spent his final years, and I agreed to go with him on that journey even though I wasn't sure what we were hoping to find or what purpose it would serve beyond satisfying a need to make the abstract information concrete by standing in the actual locations where those events had occurred. We drove to Durham first, parked on Faber Street and looked at the house where my grandfather had lived in the 1990s, walked through the neighborhood and tried to imagine what his daily life had been like during those years when he was building a quiet existence based on manual labor and isolation from everything he'd known before. My father stood in front of that brick ranch for 20 minutes without speaking, and when he finally turned away and walked back to the car, he said that seeing the physical evidence made it real in ways that documents and photographs hadn't, that standing in the place where his father had chosen to live rather than coming home forced him to confront the fact that Robert Holloway had valued his freedom and his escape more than his responsibilities to his family. We drove to Florida next, visited the retirement community where my grandfather had spent his final years, and talked to residents who'd known him as Bob Holloway, a quiet man who'd kept to himself but who'd been skilled at woodworking and had created beautiful pieces that were still displayed in the community center. One of those pieces was a hand-carved bench with my grandfather's initials on the underside, and my father sat on that bench for a long time, running his hands over the smooth wood and the careful joinery that demonstrated skill and patience and care that had gone into creating something meant to last beyond the creator's lifetime. He said it was strange to think that his father had been capable of that level of craftsmanship and attention to detail, while also being capable of abandoning his children and living under a false premise for 33 years, that the two aspects of his character seemed incompatible, but had somehow coexisted in the same person. I said that people were complicated, that they were capable of kindness and cruelty simultaneously, that my grandfather had probably been genuinely skilled and had taken real pride in his work, while also carrying the guilt and shame of what he'd done to his family, and that those contradictions didn't cancel each other out, but existed in tension throughout his life. We visited the marina where my grandfather's ashes had been scattered, stood on the dock looking out at the water, and tried to imagine what his final years had been like, whether he'd found any peace, or whether he'd been haunted until the end by the choices he'd made in 1986. My father said he didn't know whether to forgive his father or to hate him, that both responses felt inadequate to the complexity of what had happened and the decades of deception that had shaped multiple lives in ways that couldn't be undone or repaired. He said he'd spent 38 years grieving a death that hadn't happened, had built his adult identity around being the son who'd lost his father too young and had risen to the challenge of supporting his family through that tragedy. And now he had to reconstruct his understanding of himself and his history around the reality that his father had chosen to leave, and that the tragedy had been manufactured rather than suffered. I didn't have answers for him, could only stand there and witness his processing of information that challenged everything he'd believed about his family and his past, and I realized that uncovering the truth had created as many problems as it had solved, had opened wounds that might never fully heal, even as it had answered questions that had lingered unresolved for nearly 4 decades. The house in Durham where my grandfather had lived on Faber Street was sold again 6 months after our visit, and the new owners renovated it extensively, removing whatever traces might have remained of the years when Robert Holloway had occupied that space and tried to build a life separate from his past. The retirement community in Florida has a memorial garden where residents' names are inscribed on plaques when they die, and my grandfather's name is there among the others, Robert James Holloway, 1936-2019. With no indication that the person commemorated had been living under a cloud of deception and guilt for most of his adult life. I visited that memorial twice since we first discovered it, stood there reading the names and wondering how many of the other people commemorated had their own secrets and their own reasons for ending up in a retirement community with no family connections. And I've thought about how easy it is to disappear in modern America if you're willing to live quietly and modestly, and avoid attracting the kind of attention that would make authorities or systems look too closely at who you claim to be. My grandmother died in 2023 without ever knowing that her husband had survived his supposed drowning, that he'd lived another 33 years, just a few hours away from where she'd raised their children alone, and had struggled through decades of financial hardship that his stolen money could have alleviated. My father decided not to tell her when we first discovered the truth. Said she'd suffered enough, and that there was no point in adding this final betrayal to the accumulation of pain she'd endured since 1986, and I'd agreed with that decision even though it meant maintaining the lie for her final years. After her funeral, my father said he was glad she'd never known, that she'd died believing her husband had been a good man who'd been taken from them by tragic accident, rather than learning that he'd been a criminal who'd abandoned them deliberately, and that preserving that fiction had been the last kindness he could offer her. I wondered if my grandmother had suspected the truth, if she'd had doubts similar to the ones the detective had expressed, but had chosen to maintain the official story because the alternative was too painful to acknowledge, or because she'd wanted to protect her children from knowing what their father had really been. The embezzlement money was never recovered, the offshore account having been closed, and the funds moved through channels that made them impossible to trace after so many years and so many jurisdictions. The company that had been robbed no longer exists, having been acquired and absorbed by larger corporations in the decades since my grandfather's theft. And there's no one left who cares enough about $75,000 stolen in 1985 to pursue recovery or justice at this late date. My father has considered contacting the company's successors to tell them what we discovered, to close that loop and potentially allow them to recover something from my grandfather's estate if there's anything left. but he's hesitated because doing so would make the story public and would attach our family name to crimes and deceptions that we had no part in and no responsibility for beyond the genetic connection to the person who committed them. I've told him the decision is his to make, that I'll support whatever choice he makes about how to handle the information we've uncovered, but that I understand the desire to keep it private and avoid the complications that would come from turning family tragedy into public record. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation where we uncover the staged deaths that people use to escape their pasts and discover how those elaborate deceptions reshape families across generations in ways that can never be fully repaired or understood.